Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to this briefing. You are being hosted by Syracuse University's Institute for Democracy, Journalism, and Citizenship, and of course, the National Task Force on Election Crises. I'm Margaret Talev, Director of the IDJC, and your moderator for our conversation today. And I just want to say to everyone who's able to join us live, thank you for joining. I know today is another very busy day in politics. Of course, Donald Trump has been on the stand and I think is back after lunch now for his fraud trial in New York. I know that's keeping many of you busy. And tomorrow, of course, is election day for several interesting off-year contests. And we are all watching with a lot of interest to see whether the GOP further cements power in Virginia, what happens in Ohio on those ballot measures on abortion and marijuana, and of course, the governor's races in Kentucky, and surprisingly, all eyes on Mississippi, where Elvis's cousin is on the ballot as a Democrat. So thank you, Elvis. But the reason we're here today is to take the long view. We are 1 year out from the 2024 general election, just months from the start of the first primaries. And our focus today is really on some of the structural and calendar vulnerabilities in the system. So we're going to hear about 3 trends to watch, and then we welcome your questions. And if we don't know the answers to your questions, we will take them down and get back to you. So this conversation is on the record. You can submit your questions using the Q&A function. And this session will also be recorded for those who can't join us in real time. So on to our panelists. We'll be hearing from Paul Smith, Senior Vice President at the Campaign Legal Center, and Mary McCord, who's Executive Director for the Institute of Constitutional Advocacy and a visiting professor at Georgetown Law. Both are members of the National Task Force on Election Crises, and their full bios are linked on the invitation that each of you received to this event. And then I'd like to introduce you to 2 great colleagues of mine at Syracuse University, Johanna Dunaway, a political scientist at the Maxwell School and research director for the IDJC, and also Joshua Darr, a professor of political communications at the Newhouse School and the IDJC's senior researcher. Their work focuses on political communications and elections, public opinion, news consumption, and the relationship between polarization and local news. One last bit of background. The IDJC is a nonpartisan institute. We're focused on the challenges to and the connections between democratic governance and journalism. And we're looking at the role that national and local news can play in combating misinformation, reducing political polarization, and promoting civil discourse and engaged citizenship. So please stay tuned with us for election-themed research events and public engagement in 2024. For more on the Election Task Force, you should have that address in your chat, but if you can't see it, it is www.electiontaskforce.org. The National Task Force on Election Crises is a diverse and cross-partisan group. It was started in 2019 and brings together more than 50 experts in election law, election administration, national security, cybersecurity, voting rights, civil rights, technology, media, public health, and emergency responses. The aim of this group is to prevent election crises and to ensure free and fair and safe elections across the country, in part by reforming election systems. And I wanted to flag for everyone on this call, this task force is set to launch a new tool early next year that is aimed at helping both the press and the public to track and analyze threats in several categories: in election administration, disinformation, political violence and intimidation, and sort of bad faith plays by key actors involving a foreign or cyber interference. Okay, with all of that bio underway, let's get started on the 3 areas we're going to talk about today. One is election certification and the ECRA. How well can county and state actors complete their administrative and certification processes under the deadlines of the Electoral Count Reform Act? 2, indictments and the election calendar, sort of topical today, but how the former president's court dates could intersect with the election calendar, and are there some vulnerabilities that convergence could cause? And finally, trust in our public elections, or rather public trust in our elections. How does the public's trust or lack of it in the wake of events like COVID-19 and January 6th impact the security of our elections. So to get started, Paul, I would like to get started with you. The ECRA, that's the Electoral Count Reform Act, was passed more than a year ago in 2022 to sort of clear up any ambiguities in the Electoral Count Act of 1887. I wanted to get your sense of what the impact of this new law is and whether a repeat of January 6th is less likely or whether you still have concerns heading into 2024.
Well, thank you, Margaret. Hi, everybody. I think it's important to start off by talking about a lot of the good things that are in the Electoral Count Reform Act, the things that address a lot of the ambiguities that were exploited 3 years ago, but coming up 4 years ago, in terms of how we get from Election Day to January 6th to the inauguration. And the new law does say things like who has to certify who were the elected electors in each state. It has to be the governor. It sets a deadline for that to occur 6 days before the Electoral College meets. It provides that in most situations, the governor's certification is going to be conclusive. And so most of the time, it's very unlikely we're going to have two sets of electors show up from any one state. That the fake electors concept seems to be pretty well dealt with. And then when we get to January 6th, there's a much higher limit requirement for filing of objections to the votes that have been sent in by the states. You have to have more than 20% of each House of Congress. And of course, the other thing it does is it makes clear that, as we all knew, but makes it even clearer that the vice president doesn't have the power to throw votes out unilaterally. It's merely a ministerial role. And so, a lot of the things that we worried a lot about when we saw the way they were being exploited last time have been dealt with, and I think we should all be glad about that. What are we worried about for the next time? It's not so much January 6th. The really critical period, as Margaret suggested, is getting from Election Day to the certification in each state of who was elected. And there's an awful lot of ways in which that process of counting and getting to a certification of the votes can be messed up in a given state. Just to give you some examples, we've seen some of this recently. You could have some counties, simply rogue counties, refusing to certify the results in states where there's not a good legal remedy for that. And some state laws are have gaps in that area. If you had a 2000 in Florida situation where it was very close, requiring lots of recount fights, those can take a great deal of time, and it would be very difficult for a governor to be in a position to do the certification 6 days before the Electoral College meets. The state law and federal law could be in direct conflict in that situation, and the governor may just not know who won the election in that state at the time the deadline is set. So that would be a big problem. A third kind of issue that could arise in this period of time between the election and the certification is interference, destruction of ballots by rogue people, violence, preventing people from counting the votes. That kind of thing is very difficult to deal with if it really becomes a serious problem. And again, we could have a compromise of the sanctity of knowing what votes were counted and the ability to count them very well. All of those are all big potential problems still out there that the Electoral Count Reform Act didn't really address. Some of them hopefully addressed under state law, but probably not as effectively as they could be. And then there's a set of problems that can happen on Election Day itself. If you have a major weather catastrophe in one part of a state, if you have violence or hacking that prevents some part of the state from voting or from only allow some voting, but not everybody to vote, you could have a huge fight after Election Day about the sole remedy for that kind of thing that the Electoral Count Reform Act provides, which is a revote after the fact. But who votes, when this will happen, how much opportunity to vote, it all could very much disrupt the level of confidence in the outcome in that state if something like that were to happen. And that's certainly not impossible, particularly in this day and age of computer hacking. But once we get to the point where the governor certifies, hopefully that will take care of it. And the other thing I would mention is if the governor is late, there is a remedy, which is an emergency cause of action that goes up to the Supreme Court between that deadline and the actual meeting of the Electoral College, with the ability to get up to the court and get a decision really, really fast. And so hopefully that means every state will be able to cast electoral votes on the requisite day in the middle of December. And after that, the process should proceed very smoothly through January 6th and on to the inauguration, given the reforms that have now been put in place.
Okay. Well, great. So ECRA sounds like it has probably gone a long way, but doesn't get rid of all of your worries.
All sorts of horrible things can still seem possible in this day and age.
Mary, I would like to go to you. For the first time in U.S. history, you've got a former president who's also very likely to become the GOP nominee once again, facing the music on all these sort of multiple civil and criminal charges in state and federal courts. As you look at the calendar, what do you see as the major milestones to watch? And when and where, and how is that going to impact? Why would it impact the 2024 elections?
Great. The dates, I've been making a list of dates here because there are just so many dates going on. I think it's important to keep in mind that in the same period, this 1 year you've already, indicated that we have between now and the election, not only do we have 4 criminal trials, pending, 3 of which have dates, and I'll talk about those dates, 1 that doesn't yet have a date. I think it's unlikely we'll get to all 4, but there are 4 criminal cases pending against the former president. There are also, as you indicated, he is right now, engaged in the middle of a civil trial, a civil fraud trial in New York. He also faces in January another trial related to the E. Jean Carroll defamation. So he has civil cases, criminal cases, and in Colorado and Minnesota, there are courts hearing whether he is even qualified to hold office as president again under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. So that's just a few. There are some other sort of related cases out there, but these are the big ones between now and the election. But it's not just the trial dates that will have an impact. There could be decisions on motions, there could be appeals of those motions, and there could be decisions that get issued before any criminal trial ever gets to a conclusion. So irrespective of whether there's any conviction, there could be so many other things that come into play. So let me talk about a few of them. Right now, of course, today, Donald Trump is testifying in the civil fraud trial in New York. The judge there has, of course, already made a determination that he and his sons and their entities did engage in the fraudulent overvaluation of assets for purposes of getting favorable terms on bank loans and insurance loans. That has resulted in the judge making an order that Mr. Trump's business certificates be withdrawn in New York City, which is a huge, huge penalty. This trial is about the amount of disgorgement that he may have to pay, and his sons and the entities, in order to sort of compensate for the favorable benefit he got from the overvaluation, and also to determine some personal liability on individual accounts. The reason I bring this up is because one date that I don't know how many people are focused on is the appeal of that initial summary judgment decision. There's first going to be a hearing November 13th, so just 1 week from today, in the appellate court in New York about the motion to stay that summary judgment for a full appeal of it, right? And then there's that full appeal of it, because for Mr. Trump, whether he's able to continue to do business in New York, all of his real estate empire, this is a very significant event for him. And whenever the court rules on that, and I can't tell you when that'll be, that could definitely have an impact, right, on primaries, on the convention, depending on when a ruling comes out. If it were to be determined basically that his businesses, he no longer can operate, that's a pretty significant thing. Now, obviously, he put those in trust during his first term in office, but still, he's not, he hasn't sold them, gotten rid of them. He very much maintains his businesses. Obviously, we have then.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to stop you for a second. When you say you could impact, primaries or caucuses, do you mean that it could impact public opinion ahead of those votes? Or do you mean that it could have any impact on those dates going forward? In other words, as we look at the Trump court calendar, is there any vulnerability or mechanism in the process for the dates of any of these elections to be changed, or will they go on no matter what? And the only question here is he so impacted or distracted by what's going on that it may impact how voters see him or his ability to focus?
Right. No, I should have been more specific about that, particularly with respect to these civil cases, but also for the criminal cases. Even if he were to actually be convicted before a primary or before the general election, that would not disqualify him from running, right? And so I'm not suggesting the primary dates will change, or Super Tuesday will change, or the RNC convention will change, although I suppose they could, or certainly not that the election date in 2024 would change. But in terms of things that could impact the electorate and thereby impact their decision on who they're going to vote for, there are many, many things that are coming up, including this civil case, as well as a second defamation case being brought by E. Jean Carroll, which is set to go to trial in January 16th. Then, of course, we have the DC January 6th related election and interference case. This is the federal case brought by Jack Smith, which is set for trial March the 4th, the day before Super Tuesday. But between now and March the 4th, there's a lot of motions being litigated. One of the most significant, I think, in terms of having some potential to derail that trial date, is a motion that the entire case should be dismissed on the grounds of presidential immunity. This is an argument that Mr. Trump is making, that he is absolutely immune for any actions he took during his time in office that were within the outer perimeter of his official responsibilities. And he basically claims that everything he did, talking about fraud in the election, contacting state legislators to try to get them to, send up other slates of electors, talking about contingent, he calls them contingent electors rather than fraudulent electors, to meet and cast their ballots, talking to Secretary of State Raffensperger, talking to Vice President Pence about rejecting essentially the votes from the swing states. These are things he also says were all within his official responsibilities. Of course, you talk to legislators. Of course, you talk to your own vice president. Of course, you talk to others, and therefore he's absolutely immune. That motion is fully briefed. The government says he's not entitled to any such immunity, and even if he was entitled to any type of immunity, kind of like civil immunity for things within the outer perimeter of your official acts, everything that they've charged him with, says the government says, is far outside the outer perimeter of what a president does under his Article 2 responsibilities under the Constitution. So what's significant about that is that if he loses that motion in the district court, it will be appealable. So many times in a criminal case, you cannot take any appeal as the defendant until the end of the case. But when it's about immunity, that's about immunity from ever even having to stand trial. So he would be able to appeal that to the DC Circuit. If he lost there, he would be able to appeal that to the Supreme Court. And it is possible that the timing of this could interfere with the March 4th trial, because if the Supreme Court hadn't yet made a decision, assuming it goes there, I think Judge Chutkan in DC would be very reluctant to start a trial when we've got immunity on the line, right? So that could impact that date. There are a number of other motions to dismiss, 4 others or 3 others that are currently pending. The government is filing its response today. Those will be heard. There are some of those make arguments about First Amendment protection, double jeopardy. He's arguing he can't be tried and convicted for things that he was acquitted of by the Senate after impeachment, by the House, and other motions like that. Most of those would not necessarily be appealable interlocutorally, except for this one where he's making a double jeopardy argument. So many of those I think won't throw off the trial date, but at least one potentially could. Then, of course, he has his March 25th trial date in the Manhattan state case brought by the district attorney there for fraudulent business records relating to the hush money payments made to Stormy Daniels. That date could very well get bumped by the DC trial if it starts on time. And Alvin Bragg has indicated that's okay if that needs to happen. Then, of course, the next date on the calendar in terms of trial dates is the May 20th trial, another federal case brought by special counsel Jack Smith. That's in Florida. That's the Mar-a-Lago documents case relating to the mishandling of classified documents and national defense information and obstruction of justice, but based on alleged efforts to essentially cover up this mishandling and make false statements to the Department of Justice about his compliance with their request to return all classified information. Judge Cannon in that case has indicated, and right now all motions hearings are stayed. She has indicated that she is considering pushing off the dates, not only for motions, but even potentially for the trial in that case. The one we don't have even a date for yet is the Georgia state prosecution of Mr. Trump. There are originally were 19 defendants charged with RICO conspiracy and multiple other conspiracies and fraud-related acts arising out of the effort to overturn the election results in Georgia. And that case, as probably everyone here knows, there have been 4 individuals who have pleaded guilty. There are loads and loads of pending motions, but there is no trial date set yet for the remaining, I guess, 15 defendants, including Mr. Trump. There are hearings coming up, I believe, in early December on motions to dismiss. I could be wrong on those dates. So again, these are cases as well where we expect Mr. Trump will also be raising immunity defenses. So there's the potential there again for appeals if he loses those motions and possible delay of that case ever getting to trial. Then the last thing I want to mention, because a lot of this has been very date heavy, is that we do just last week, a Colorado state court heard a week-long evidentiary hearing on whether Mr. Trump would be qualified to serve in office under the 14th Amendment, Section 3, based on whether he could be found to have engaged in an insurrection or rebellion against the Constitution. Similar litigation is pending in Minnesota and elsewhere. And no matter what happens in those cases, those are things that also could be appealed, could also potentially go up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and again, could have an impact on at least voters, making decisions during the primaries and then at the convention and before the general election, but also could potentially have an impact, obviously, in a case like that, about whether he can actually appear on the ballot. So I'll stop there just at the risk of confusing things even more.
A lot of dates, and then hold your date for some other undated TBD dates. Right. Mary, I want to move to Johanna and Josh and then to questions, but I do want to ask you very quickly this, which is there any legal scenario or theory that says that if Donald Trump were to stand as the GOP nominee and lose the election again, that he would be able to argue that all of the multiple cases that he was tied up in impeded his ability to be a candidate? Is there any scenario under which he might seek to challenge the election based on the litigation? I know we've been talking about this the other way around. How will the litigation impact the election? But in the reverse. Well, is there any scenario? It's Donald Trump. He'll find a lawyer to file a case making that argument. I think the legal
validity of it would be very suspect. I'd have to see it. I'm not even exactly sure what his cause of action would be, but he is already essentially trying to make that argument in his existing motions, right? His First Amendment related arguments in the January 6th related case are very much on the along the lines of, it's my First Amendment right to talk about fraud, and this case is really just one of political persecution. He's actually filed a motion to dismiss the indictment based on selective and vindictive prosecution. Again, that doesn't mean he couldn't try after the fact to file something, and I expect that he probably will, because that if he does not prevail, because that's just the kind of litigious person that he is.
But courts are very, very reluctant to throw out an election after it's
yes,
based on something that everybody knew was already happening. That would be almost inconceivable.
I agree. I think they would fail, but that doesn't mean I mean, nearly 65 cases failed, and it didn't keep him from bringing them.
So thank you for that. So Joanna and Josh, I want to move to you on the issue of the electorate, voters, news consumers, et cetera. Joanna, can we talk a little bit about what we know about mistrust in U.S. elections, what we know about where confidence in our electoral system currently sits, and whether you see any ways to shore up confidence in this or future elections?
There's a couple of main things just really quickly to say about the kind of level of trust, and then if I run out of time, maybe I'll put a pin in the part about things to shore up, since that might be something we get questions about and that other people can also answer. But there's a few sort of maybe non-intuitive things. One is that trust in elections in the US isn't as much about the actual performance and administration of those elections as we, I think, once thought as researchers, and also as people might assume just based on common sense. According to, for example, a recent MIT report out of their election lab, and then some of our own research, people's attitudes towards elections and trust in elections are based in part on their experiences, but are also really heavily influenced by what they hear from the media and people running for office themselves, office holders, and other experts, including pundits and so forth. The other thing is that it's heavily affected by who wins and who loses, as you might expect, right? So those whose side loses are far more likely to have mistrust following an election than if your side wins. But even those perceptions, if your side loses and your person sort of bows out gratefully saying, or gracefully saying, yes, I lost. This was a free and fair election. I'm sorry that I lost, but I did. Then those partisans might be more accepting of the result than if the person does not bow out as gracefully, right? As we've seen some candidates do over, recently and in days past, right? So again, it matters and is heavily shaped a lot by what the elite politicians in those positions are saying at the time. So it also matters sort of what they expect. So this is where problems with recent elections and the polling error comes into play. If all of the elections thought the election was going to go one way or another in certain places because of polling data, and then the outcome is different, that's another thing that feeds mistrust. And then finally, I'll just say that it also, the block of voters in the electorate, or the electorate itself, is not a monolith, right? It's not just partisans either. There are other groups. There are different racial and ethnic groups, for example. There are men and women, and they also have different levels of perceptions based on the context and the moment in politics. So, for example, where they don't have higher levels of mistrust broadly in elections, Black Americans and some other racial and ethnic groups that tend to be underrepresented in the political process are more likely to be concerned that their vote wasn't accurately counted. So, or their group. And so that can also, though, vary according to the context of the election, what the initial expectations were, what happened, and what leaders and the media are saying. So highly variable, highly influential. And then maybe if we have time in a minute, I can talk a bit about some things that we think can maybe be done to shore up that trust, because I'm sure that might be part of the Q&A as well.
Great. Well, Josh, I mean, let's just kind of add local news in particular into the mix, in part for some of our participants. We know from both of your research and from other research that there is a real connection between polarization and news consumption, but that local news can be the answer to this in many cases because you may have more trust. And also the nature of local news coverage may just be less inherently polarized or about polarizing issues. So for reporters who are trying to sort of debunk conspiracy theories or misinformation, how can reporters and perhaps local reporters in particular address some of these issues in a way that actually helps voters have more confidence rather than fuel their lack of confidence?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great question because, for all the talk about national and presidential elections, we have intensely localized election processes in this country, and the way people cast ballots, the way they're counted, the speed at which they are counted varies greatly between cities and towns in the same state, much less between states. And so it's important, I think, for local reporters, such as we still have them, to set expectations based in real information about election processes before the election. I think that, talking a year out is not actually really too early. How are you going to cover the election? How are you going to make decisions about when to call it? Demystify this process. Setting expectations that poll workers and vote counters are going to do something, at this speed. They have good intentions. Here's what they do. Here's why it takes a while. Don't underestimate also how much people are interested in basic information. Johanna and I did an event in Milwaukee last year where the person in charge of their local nonprofit news outlet said their most read story before their election was, what does the mayor do? It wasn't anything about the race. It was just like, literally, what's the mayor's job that I'm trying to hire this person for? So no amount of detail of how to vote, who votes, how it's counted, when polls close is too much. If you've only strategy game framed the election leading up to it, and you haven't provided that basic civic information, then people are going to see the results through that lens instead of through the lens of institutional processes functioning as they should. And there's lots of resources on this. Maybe they've grown even a little since the last, but the National Council of State Legislatures has a particularly good one for how votes are done across the country. Again, this is tougher as local news cuts more jobs, but local knowledge matters. Local reporters matters. A couple local reporters became national celebrities in the last election. But I think consulting people that know what's going on in those areas is important. If false claims arise and you have this background of factual reporting on processes and meant to, discuss institutional trust, you can refer back to that and minimize people's perceptions of bias because you did it before you knew the result. So overall, I will say, I can't cite all of these claims here, but mediafordemocracy.org was a political science-driven approach to this stuff in the last election and still has a lot of those resources up there. So that would be my final recommendation.
Terrific. Well, thank you guys so much. Anyone listening or watching us right now, you do have a Q&A feature. I invite you now to submit any questions you might have for our panelists. We have perhaps another 10 minutes left, so I want to be conscious of everyone's time. But go ahead now and submit some of those questions. And Paul, I have a question here for you. On the Newhouse Speaker in recent days, of course, Mike Johnson was elected Speaker of the House. And as you know, he was in the camp that sought not only not to certify Joe Biden's election win, but to try to block it procedurally through the courts. Do you see risks now going forward for someone who's been an election denier to have the House Speaker be someone in that role? And how would you watch for that to play out? When would that become a concern for you?
It's interesting. I really don't have too much in the way of concerns about that. Under the Electoral Count Reform Act, the way January 6th operates, the two houses of the Congress meet together with the vice president presiding, as we all remember. And even if they succeed in getting over the threshold to have enough vote objections to divide up and go up, separate and debate whether a particular state's votes should be counted, the only thing that the speaker does is preside at that session. He can't make anything happen. And so a single member of Congress, even the Speaker of the House in this particular process, isn't as powerful as he is any other day in Congress, where the Speaker has all sorts of power about the agenda of the Hill. So this isn't not something that I wake up worrying about at night. I have a lot of other things I wake up worrying about at night, but not that one.
Okay. Great. Mary, we've talked a lot about the election calendar and former President Trump's potential avenues for litigation or appeal. Are you looking at the potential for any new precedent to stem from the litigation that's already underway, or litigation that you would anticipate? And do you see any scenario where that could actually make it more difficult to prosecute ex-presidents for election interference going forward?
The motion I had mentioned to dismiss based on absolute presidential immunity, if the courts were to rule that he does have such immunity, that would be a very capacious interpretation of an immunity that doesn't actually even exist in the Constitution, that something has been wholly created by the courts and never applied in a criminal case where a former president is charged with crimes committed while the person was president. That's just not happened before. And the law that has developed was in a civil case, which is a very different situation. And the courts basically developed this doctrine of immunity for things you did as part of your official acts, immunity from civil liability, in order to keep the president from being distracted by worries about things like civil liability when it comes to things that are just clearly within his authorities under Article 2 of the Constitution. So it would be an extreme expansion, I think, of that, to apply that to, maybe you could apply that rubric, that sort of analysis to criminal charges, but to find in a case like this where the activity of the president seems to be so outside his Article 2 duties, that would be an extremely expansive construction that would definitely make it much easier for presidents in the future to engage in similar type of coercion when it comes to elections. I don't foresee that result, but you asked the question, so I answered it. Two other areas I think there could be, well, there's more than two areas we could get new law here, but two of the things that go more to your question, I think, are one is this question of First Amendment as a defense, right? He's trying to argue that his entire indictment should be dismissed, the January 6th related indictment, because he was engaged in personal speech on a matter of public concern, and that's protected, even if false, that's protected under the Constitution. And again, a capacious ruling there could at least allow for future presidents to put out falsehoods in many ways, the same way that President Trump has falsehoods that people rely on. Falsehoods, just as falsehoods are one thing, but falsehoods that cause harm, cause injury because they're relied on, and that harms either people or, here we would say, voting and the electorate, that would be a pretty significant ruling. And then obviously this interpretation of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment and what it is to engage in insurrection or rebellion against the Constitution as a former officer of the United States, and whether that's disqualifying, would obviously, have significant ramifications going forward, or could.
So some areas to watch for precedent, to be sure. And then Johanna and Josh, I have a joint question for the two of you. The question is the trust in elections something that should be considered part of a long-term decline in trust in institutions overall? And if you see it that way, does it change the way you would approach any interventions about improving it?
You want to start, Paul, or I can start and then hand it to
I
you?
think that's for,
No.
I think it's for Joanna and for Josh.
Oh, for them. I thought you said it was from them. Never mind. I'll shut up. I have thoughts.
Good. Well, we'd love to hear from everyone. So start with Joanna and Josh. What do you guys think? Is the declining trust in elections just part of the broader decline of trust in everything?
I mean, I'll just say, I think as part of the earlier answer that I mentioned, it's a big, I mean, polarization is a big driver of it, because as the electorate is increasingly disliking politicians on the other side, they're more and more upset when that person wins instead of their person. And then they're hearing from their person all the reasons why that person shouldn't have won, or why maybe the election had problems or something like that. So I think this is, it's much more, I mean, those other declining institutions could also have something to do with polarization, but I think here we see a really clear link between the two things feeding each other. So I'll let Josh chime in, but that's kind of more what I think is the issue here, based on what we've seen.
I think the overall declining trust in institutions provides the conditions for declining trust in elections specifically, but based on what we know about how people follow politicians' actions and speeches when forming their own opinions on things, maybe things they hadn't thought about before, I think that obviously the massive amount of elite priming of elections not being trustworthy that we've seen is likely to be more damaging this time. So it may be part of the long-term decline, but recent rhetoric has certainly accelerated it in ways that we would expect to.
That when leaders of political movements tell you that you can't trust the election results, that has an accelerating effect, at least with the bases that they're reaching. Okay.
People listen. Yeah.
Mary, I know you said you had a thought on that before we wrap things up. What were you thinking on that question?
Well, my organization has just finished a series of 4 regional convenings, Great Lakes, Pacific Northwest, Southwest, Southeast, where we've brought together local, state, federal officials across the election space, as well as law enforcement and public safety, and also community activists and organizers also across the election space. And in every place we went, we would have people, election officials from the local level all the way, like think Maricopa County, Arizona, for example, all the way up to the state level, Secretary of States, we had from a number of states, talking about not only the perception, at least among some, based on listening to the disinformation and misinformation coming from our elected officials and coming from the former president, not only a loss of faith, but also they have suffered personal threats, in many cases, very, very serious threats that have actually resulted in criminal prosecutions and that are ongoing, and not just the threats against themselves, but also against their families. And so, clearly you don't get to the point of threats if you haven't lost some faith in the institutions. And I think it's important to understand the political violence that is resulting from the disinformation about the integrity of our election systems. And it goes beyond elections. I mean, we have the disinformation about the weaponization of the Department of Justice and the FBI against political enemies. And that's also eroding trust and resulting in significant threats against those folks. There were threats against members of Congress who didn't vote for Jim Jordan to be the House Speaker, to come back to your House Speaker issue, right? Again, because this climate right now of lack of trust in institutions fueled by disinformation and by really just pretty violent rhetoric is having effects across, I think, all branches. And I haven't even talked about the Supreme Court, but we know it's there too.
I am looking at the clock. We're actually a minute past when we promised to let everyone go. Our deal was give us an hour and we'll give you back 15 minutes. So we'll try to hold true to that. For reporters or any of the guests joining us, if you have any other questions today or in the future, you can reach the task force by email. That email address is tfrequest@protectdemocracy.org. That's tfrequest@protectdemocracy.org. And you can reach the Institute for Democracy, Journalism, and Citizenship here in DC at Syracuse at democracy@syr.edu. Panel, I want to thank you for your time. And as we go, just ask each of you very quickly, is there a state in particular that you're watching for an interesting legal test, or is there an early date on the calendar that you are fixated on to see the first big test of the 2024 elections? Paul.
Our team starting a trial today in Arizona on a very broad set of restrictions they've just put in place to try to keep voters of color from voting. So I think of that as the sort of first skirmish as we get toward the election of the fight. So allow everybody to vote. But after that, of course, there's the issue of how the votes get counted. But we do have to have the right to vote protected, and it's going to be under threat for the next 12 months.
Mary.
Yeah, besides all the litigation I'm tracking, I'm particularly interested in the Virginia election tomorrow, just as you indicated at the top, because Virginia, I think in many ways has got a little bit of everything that we see across the country. And so I think how it comes out will be a really important harbinger of things to come.
Johanna and Josh.
Just the first big early primary dates, just to see what happens, the ones that are the big toss-up states and that tend to be close anyway.
I'll say New Hampshire specifically to that because their primary is big and complicated and involves a lot of independents, and it seems like every 2 blocks in New Hampshire elects a state rep. So it's always worth watching as a harbinger of what's to come.
Okay, well, with that, task force, thank you. My colleagues, Joanna and Josh, thank you. And everyone who joined us, thank you so much. And again,